In the 1960s, a secretive government agency was created with one purpose: to invent the vast weapon systems of the future. This agency is DARPA. DARPA is responsible for the early creation of artificial intelligence, GPS, robotic limbs, stealth technology, and even the most egregious chemical weapon ever used in war. Our guest today is a technology journalist and author. He was given special access to DARPA and wrote a book called The Department of Mad Scientists. Now let's hear from Michael Belfiore.
Let's say I'm a technology writer. I'm trying to look ahead the next few years about what's coming next that might change the way we work or live or play, or hopefully for the better. I sort of look at what I do as applied science fiction. So I try to find the things that people are cooking up that might actually change things. And there's a fine line between mad scientist and crackpot and innovator who's actually going to change things. And that line is often very hard to discern. And that's part of what I really like about the work I do. You never really know what crazy idea is actually going to work out.
And so how did you get involved in this? I mean, what initially drew you to it?
Depends on how far back do you want to go?
Take us back, Michael.
When I was 6 years old, I was in the public library, and for the first time, I went to the grown-up section. And my parents were both voracious readers, so books were always around everywhere. It was just taken for granted everyone was going to read in the house. But this time I wandered over to the section that didn't have the picture books. I wanted to see what was over there. And I just happened to pull down from the shelf a book by Robert A. Heinlein. It was called Rocket Ship Galileo. It was what they used to call his juvenile novels. And it was all about a group of people who built their own spaceship and flew in it to the moon. And I picked that book because it actually did have pictures. It had line drawings of people inside the spaceship looking out through a porthole at planet Earth. So I just found this really intriguing. And this was back in, I was 6 years old. This was 1975. And little did I know that people had actually gone to the moon. No one had told me this. So it was a couple years later, I was at the Boys Club in Santa Monica, California. I grew up my early part of my life in California. And I saw a picture, this famous picture of Buzz Aldrin standing on the moon. And I knew instantly it was a photograph. And I knew from my reading of science fiction up to that point that it was the moon. And, I frantically tried to grab someone who worked there, one of these counselors. Hey, is that a guy on the moon? Is that really? And yeah. He just kind of brushed it off like it was no big deal. But that really, those two things really blew my mind. The idea that we could actually go to the moon and maybe build our own way to get there, and then actually people had done it. That kind of set me on this trajectory of first writing science fiction, and I published some short stories, and then discovered I could make a living as a software manual writer, a technical writer. So I started out doing that. And then in it was the early 2000s, these people out in the desert built their own spaceship, and they went supersonic in it as a test flight. And I thought, well, I've got to be part of this somehow. What can I do? Well, I can write about this. So that's when I started dialing up magazines, newspapers, anyone who would listen to me, telling them, hey, these people just built their own spaceship. No, you don't know that? Okay, well, you need someone there to report on that. So that launched my career as a journalist. I got an assignment with a local arts magazine here in the Hudson Valley where I was living at that time. And the editor said, well, this is totally inappropriate, but this is so cool. We'll give you the stories. That was my first feature story. And then I also got a blurb. I got to do a little write-up in the New York Post for the travel section about how this might change travel, because there's a commercial spaceship. So that was, an amazing experience. 2004, the sort of space Woodstock out in Mojave, California. All the magazine editors and broadcasters, everyone was out there. So I got to meet all these people. And that's how I got involved with popular science. got my first story, which turned out to be a cover story, feature story for Popular Science, writing about Robert Bigelow's space station that he was then building. And that just led from there on this kind of wild ride that led to a couple of book projects and lots of magazine articles, things like that.
Well, I think it's really interesting. And first off, I mean, now you've been a technology writer for 20 years. So you've been able to see the technology in real time come to life.
That's right. And that's yes, it is science fiction has come true and is coming true. And that's how I found DARPA, because they were funding a lot of these crazy rocket projects that I started writing about, starting with Spaceship One. And they provided early funding for companies like SpaceX. SpaceX exists today because of DARPA. So that led
And
me to DARPA. And from there I wrote more articles and got a book deal writing about DARPA.
yeah, so let's go back and let's first set the groundwork because, I was telling people, I'm so excited to talk about DARPA today. You'd be amazed how few people know what DARPA actually is, and the ones that do are full of conspiracy theories. So we want to find out about all of this. We want to talk about the good, the bad, and the weird of DARPA. So can you tell us, first off, what is DARPA? What does it stand for? How'd they get made?
DARPA stands for Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and they came out of the Cold War, the seminal moment when the Soviet Union launched the very first artificial satellite, Sputnik, in 1957. And that just threw everybody in the US for a loop, politicians, engineers, academics, everybody. It's hard to imagine the fervor that created, this kind of fever. Oh no, the Soviets are ahead of us now. They had just um, not too far in the past, sort of, shown that they had this nuclear capability. They had nuclear weapons, just as we did. And Sputnik represented the capability of eventually lobbing one of these weapons around the world and sending it anywhere, dropping it anywhere in the United States. That was really the fear, that they would be able to do that. And it was also very disconcerting that not too many people had seen this coming. It was a surprise. So the Eisenhower administration said, we got to do something about this right away. Let's put together the smartest people we can find from all over the country, academics, engineers, people like this, put them in a room and have them try to anticipate the next surprise and prevent it. And as a bonus, come up with surprises of their own that we could set off, launch, whatever those things happen to be. The vast weapons systems of the future. Try to envision those. That was the phrase that was used. So the response was what was then called ARPA. They didn't have the D for defense, but it was the same organization. And then, as now, it was part of the Pentagon, the Defense Department, and reported directly to the uh, Secretary of Defense. So it's always had its kind of independent existence, and it still operates much the same way. They're in a office building and a bunch of PhDs, and only about 10% are actually military personnel, officers, things like that. Most of them are civilians from the academic world and industrial world. Um, and then they still do this job of trying to come up with technological surprise and anticipate the next technological surprise so we wouldn't be caught off guard again.
And isn't it ironic because Eisenhower was the one that warned against, and he coined the term military industrial complex. And here he
Yeah.
was creating this another arm to the military.
Yeah, that's right. That was a famous speech, his exit speech, leaving office. He said, "Beware the military industrial complex." And in that speech, he actually delineated how many civilian projects you could fund with, say, an aircraft carrier. How many schools would that be? How many? Of course, he's famous too for setting up the what they call still the Eisenhower interstate system. Connecting various parts of the country with modern roads that we take for granted now. So he was very much aware of the risks of this. Um, but DARPA sort of goes against the mold. It's not just another agency, not just another branch of the military. It's really a lean organization, operate on very small amounts of money compared to the rest of the Defense Department. The Defense Department, the budget keeps ballooning and ballooning, hundreds of billions of dollars at this point. DARPA operates today around, $3 billion, something like that, which is like a fifth of what NASA has, for example, or even less. So it was always envisioned as something that would operate more efficiently and do things more quickly than the normal military Defense Department procurement system.
And why did DARPA immediately get, or when did DARPA start to get this reputation for being the evil hand of the defense um, of our military, creating things like Agent Orange?
Oh yes, well that came out of the Vietnam War. There was this, there's various times during DARPA's history where it's been in danger of being canceled. And in fact, the director at the time, Tony Tether, that I was writing my book, he actually took it as a point of pride that he was always on the verge of getting fired. That was his like mark of success, doing something so crazy, so outrageous that he might get fired. But the agency itself has occupied this kind of precarious position as well. And one of its biggest, most expensive projects was this project called Project Agile, which I don't really get into in my book, but there are other really good books since mine that have come out, a couple of others about DARPA that go into in more detail. But the idea was to fund counterinsurgency so that U.S. forces wouldn't have to go in large numbers into Vietnam, which of course turned out, not to happen. I mean, it was not a success. Obviously, we all know what happened in Vietnam, the Vietnam War. But the idea was to come up with technological fixes that would help the local insurgents, that would help South Vietnamese fight the battle themselves. And one of those turned out to be Agent Orange, and there were different agents. There was Agent Blue, Yellow, I forget all the different colors, but Orange turned out to be the one that was used most extensively and most infamously. The idea was to defoliate the jungle so that it was easier to spot the insurgents in North Vietnamese, and also to take out their food supply. So that's pretty nasty. that's a kind of a nasty thing. And one of the DARPA program managers I interviewed for my book, he actually used that word. And he said, a lot of what we do is really nasty, and you'll never hear about it. In this case, it did get out that Agent Orange was in use, and it was sort of looked at, as sort of immoral use, chemical warfare. And then, of course, it sickened and eventually killed a lot of U.S. soldiers as well as other people on the ground. So that then, that's one example of where DARPA has gone involved in projects that it may not be seen as beneficial in the way that their program managers had hoped.
Right. So it's like what you get one program like this that gets a negative reputation in the culture, and next thing you know, it's labeled, DARPA's labeled that way. But so many things come from these projects that DARPA has created. For example, during that time, I mean, you wrote about this in your book. We didn't even have what was it? Detecting earthquakes with seismograph, right?
Yeah. So it was another that same era in the 60s. A big focus of DARPA was nuclear test detection. Project Vela was this idea that if we put seismographs all over the world and sort of triangulate where different events are coming from, then we could detect nuclear explosions. That was the idea behind it. It actually ended up contributing a lot to the science, seismology as a science, right? Sort of almost created it. And all this data was in use by scientists. So the thing about DARPA is that they don't have their own research laboratories. It's one of the things that makes them very efficient. They hire out basically all the work, including this one, this nuclear test detection, to university laboratories, to private companies, things like that. So what happens is a lot of scientists end up working on these projects who don't really have a strong connection to the military aside from getting these DARPA grants. And a lot of what DARPA does ends up funding a lot of important research, almost as a sort of side benefit or by the way. So that, to me, that's one of the big advantages or benefits of DARPA is that it funds that scientific research community on projects that are meant to have a military application, but they end up funding a lot of other things that are very useful and things that we take for granted today that are directly as a result of DARPA funding.
So that's a statistic that I want to bring up. So I read that 90% of DARPA's projects do not reach objective. But in then doing so, we come up with all these other technologies. Like, for example, the internet was created by DARPA, right?
That's right. It started out as a project called ARPANET. And to me, this is DARPA's biggest contribution. And no one had any idea back in 1969 when that first connection was made between the first two nodes on the then ARPANET. No one had any idea how big, how big an impact that would have. It took decades for that to come to fruition. But that's probably the best example of where DARPA has really made a big impact. And it's really hard to know what that impact's going to be on some of these out there projects that may not have an immediate gain, especially for the military, but that may have an outsized impact in lots of other areas. And not just the internet came from that work from that time period in the 60s and into the 70s, but other things like graphical user interfaces, the mouse. There's a great set of videos online. If you look up the mother of all demos, and this guy named Douglas Engelbart, who is then at the Stanford Research Institute, which initially was part of Stanford University, but it got split off during the Vietnam War because of student protesting. But he actually gave this demo that's gone down in history in 1968 for the most amazing tech demo ever done. And he was funded by DARPA, and so were his colleagues working on it with him. And he demonstrated all the elements of modern computing that we take for granted today. Like right now, we're doing online collaboration. Well, he had that in there. He had a little presentation screen, I was like projected, where he had in a video insert of a person he was collaborating with, and they were working together on documents and doing things like cutting and pasting and inserting, all these things no one had ever seen before in real time, interacting with a computer as though it's just another tool that you would use every day. And he mentions this thing called the mouse, and it's all there in the videos. It's really cool to watch that.
And this is 50 years ago. I mean, we're
Yeah,
talking about
more than that, 56 years ago. Yeah.
wow, yeah, yeah. And these technologies are delayed by they say that DARPA's ahead of us by 20 to 30 years, right?
Yeah, it could. That's the thing that we just never know. Like some of this stuff is crazy. So another thing that DARPA sort of almost got canceled for, or got a lot of bad press for, was this thing that was going to be envisioned as a mechanical elephant. It was part of Project Agile and this counterinsurgency work. The idea is, well, we can't get trucks through the jungles. So what can we do? Well, the other side uses elephants sometimes. Maybe we can build a mechanical elephant. So they envisioned this four-legged vehicle that you could ride in. And, the driver or pilot or whatever you want to call them would sit or actually stand in this thing and move their own legs. And that would move the mechanical beast's legs, and then it could carry cargo. So they were laughed out of the place for that, and that was beginning of the end of Project Agile. And Congress was saying, well, why are we funding this nonsense? Well, you cut to decades later, Boston Dynamics, another, a startup funded by DARPA, built these robots with four legs that could move cargo through rough terrain. You can see videos of these things too. They're called Big Dog.
Yeah, and if people want to put a picture in their image of what an image in their head of what this is, everyone has seen the videos of the robot dogs with weapons on them,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, there's the little dog, and that's the one that's in commercial production now. They're used a lot for plant inspections and things like that. Sometimes security details. Mostly not. I don't think there's any actual armed ones. Who knows? Maybe there are, but that's not usually how they're used. And before that, its predecessor was a thing called Dog that was envisioned not just for surveillance or inspections, but to carry cargo. So that sort of some of these ideas come full circle in this time that technology was there that allowed this thing to operate autonomously. And that was the key innovation that allowed that to no longer be a laughing stock. You wouldn't have to actually drive the thing. It would know. You could follow a human operator who had a controller, and it would autonomously move its legs to climb over rocks and go over snow drifts or whatever it is.
And then, so because you spent time over there and have been working in this field for so long, how are they able to get these projects funded? When you hear something crazy like the Boston Dynamics with the robot dog, and then all the way back with the robot elephant that they first were planning, is it just like open creativity there where go ahead, do what you want, and we're gonna see what happens?
DARPA projects get started in a lot of different kind of ways. And in fact, as a nice segue, I've written a guide, how to, if you have a crazy idea that you want to get DARPA funding for, there's a process, and that's outlined in a free download I have on my website. So if you go to michaelbelfiore.com, there's a how-to guide, how to get your idea to DARPA. But that's sort of over the transom. You could be anybody. You don't have to be a PhD. You don't have to have, high security, security clearance or anything like that. You literally can email any DARPA program manager. These are the people in charge of programs. And because the organization has a relatively flat structure, there are not a lot of layers of bureaucracy. It's basically program managers supported by staff, and they report to an office manager. There are 6 different program offices, each in charge of a different type of technology or focus for technology. And then there's the director. That's it. So these program managers are constantly looking for ideas from what they call the community, like you and me, or university people, things like that. So that's one idea. That's one way that ideas get into DARPA, just over the transom, just submissions from people. You just reach out. They often host events too, specifically designed to collect ideas. So you could register for one of these events and just show up and just pitch an idea. So to me, that's really exciting. I don't think there's any other place like that in the government where you could actually have a chance of funding some crazy scheme. And in my ebook, I use as an example a time machine idea for a time machine, where this crazy self-taught physicist decides he has an idea for time machine. He wants to get it funded. So I walk through the process of how he could reach out as a total unknown with no connections and possibly get funding, and how his project might get started. So that's one way they come in. Often program managers come into their office, which isn't very long. It's usually only 2, 3 years, maybe 4 years. A program manager comes in with some bee in their bonnet, a thing they want to work on. So it might be autonomous vehicles, for example. When I was writing my book, um, they were working on that. Hypersonics was another guy I was talking to who became a DARPA director. He started as a program manager, Stephen Walker. He was
And,
big on hypersonics.
and these are things I just want to put a date on this too, because these are things that we hear in conversation all the time. But when you wrote about this was when? What year was that?
Oh, my book came out in '08, I think it was, or '09. It's a
So
little
so
blurry
so
now.
so
Yeah,
2007-ish,
'09.
around there. This is where
Yeah,
they were
into
putting
'09, maybe into '08. Yeah. And
and
I tried to pick projects that I felt would still have relevance years later. So the book would be evergreen. And sure enough, autonomous vehicles, I have a chapter on that. That turned out to, still be very much relevant today. And it's now just now becoming available in production vehicles, which is really exciting to me. Like I can
And
get into my car and have it drive me wherever I want because of the groundwork that was laid by DARPA and others too. But DARPA had a lot to do with pushing that technology forward. The idea is to take the technology excuse off the table, as Tony Tether, the then director, put it. Take that technology excuse off the table. In other words, if people think this idea is ridiculous, let's build it and create a working demo and demonstrate that it's not ridiculous, is technologically feasible, and then go from there. Let others take it up to commercialize it. So it's, long story short, answering your questions, ideas come in from the community outside of DARPA and also from program managers themselves who typically enter the agency with ideas in mind that they want to work on. And then they'll go out and fund different builders. They call them performers. That's the word that DARPA uses, performers, for people who actually put nuts and bolts together, who write code, do the work of actually putting into being these crazy ideas.
And I'm glad that you mentioned the autonomous vehicle because it seems that a lot of Elon Musk has so many ties back to the things he's working on, has so many ties back to DARPA because, for example, SpaceX, his company, was one of the winners of the challenges back in the day, right?
Well, that was not a challenge, but he was funded. SpaceX was funded. DARPA, well, the military in general has always wanted a quick reactive space capability. In other words, there's some event happening around the other side of the world we need to get eyes on immediately. Can we pop up a satellite that would, take a look at it? Or can we drop cargo in that area? Maybe even soldiers. So they've got a long history of funding what they call, rapid response space missions. And SpaceX had one of the, not the only one, but they had one of the most credible proposals. With this one little rocket, it was called the Falcon 1. And Elon told me while I was writing my book before the DARPA one, I wrote a rocket book called Rocketeers. He said, like, I only have 3 shots at this. After that, I'm bust and I can't do anymore. Well, DARPA provided the funding that allowed that to happen. And actually, it took 4 tries, but he managed to get that fourth one out. But that's where SpaceX got started. It really wouldn't have gotten off the ground without that initial support from DARPA.
So this is interesting. I want to ask you a little bit more about that. So you were talking to Elon Musk, I mean, way before the Tesla days, way before the Twitter days.
Oh
You
yeah.
were you were you were speaking to him fresh out of basically his PayPal, right? And he was still just venturing off into his own world. How was
Yeah.
that?
Oh, and it was amazing. Yeah, that was a whole other thing. So, I told you I started, with this private spaceship project out in the desert, and that led me to articles and then eventually a book about all kinds of different people doing that kind of thing. And I initially didn't pay much attention to SpaceX because they were about launching satellites. And I wanted to focus on human flight because that was most exciting to me and also was close to my original inspiration for wanting to investigate all this stuff. But then I found out, well, okay, that Falcon 1, sure, it was a satellite launch, but that was envisioned to fund much bigger rockets that would then carry people eventually to Mars. Once I found that, I was like, oh, okay, here we go. We're on this now. So at the time, it was small warehouse space, not far from where they are now. It was in Hawthorne, California. Um, and they were building the Falcon 1 and they weren't getting it off the ground, but I got to go see rocket testing and got to walk. He set me loose on the shop floor. He's with my camera. He said, yeah, go ahead. Just don't get too close pictures so that our competitors don't see exactly how we're doing this. But it was pretty free and open. at the time. That's one of the appeals to me of these smaller projects. It's a lot less formal. I generally have greater access to people doing stuff and the hardware and things like that. That's why I got some time to sit down time with him, and I found, learned about his vision for Martian colonies and the future, and it's very wide-reaching vision, which, as you mentioned, touches a lot of on the same work that DARPA has done for a long time too. Neuralink, one of the things I wrote about in my book was this brain-controlled interface for prosthetic limbs. DARPA's been doing that kind of work since at least the 70s. Space, of course. So space was DARPA's initial venture. They were envisioned to counter the perceived threat in space. And then NASA took over that mission, and DARPA had one of many existential moments in its history where the space mission got taken away, and then everyone went, okay, what good is this thing? And they had to quickly pivot into information technology. Uh, but like you mentioned, self-driving cars, space, Neuralink, the brain-controlled interfaces. So, as you said, DARPA and Musk have this sort of got this kind of symbiotic relationship and at times converging on a lot of the same things.
Right. So it makes me think, I mean, did he get these ideas from, one of these DARPA challenges, or, how are there so many convergences between what he's doing and what DARPA has been doing?
Well, just like with my origin story, a lot of it comes back to science fiction. A lot of these folks have read the same books. So Robert Heinlein is one of the classics, writers of science fiction. Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, all these people inspired generations of engineers and innovators and dreamers to do these things. So robots, of course, figure really prominently in a lot of this work. Isaac Asimov, I, Robot, space, Robert Heinlein, and Asimov. So I literally would talk to people who are creating out their stuff, and I'd ask them what their inspiration was. It turns out we'd read the same books, the same novels. Yeah, oh, yeah, yeah. Like one guy I was talking to, he wanted to build the well, this was not a novel, but it's similar idea. He wanted to build the diagnostic bed on Star Trek, the original series, and that was actually a DARPA project. And there was this thing called Trauma Pod, and it was this robot thing that you put a wounded soldier into, and the thing would diagnose this person and then start operating on them or whatever it needed to do. That was a feature of work by Larry Niven, where you just throw someone in a pod and the robot would fix you up, things like that. So people were really actually consciously reference science fiction as their inspiration. In fact, when Tony Tether was in charge, he actually would put together groups of science fiction writers, and I think his predecessor did that too, to give them ideas. So there's this kind of zeitgeist, these ideas that have been floating around for decades about how humanity could be elevated by technology, and then these science fiction writers envisioned them in very specific ways, how they would work. Robert Heinlein always had rockets that took off and landed on their tails. And everybody had this idea. That's the way it's done. That's the way God and Heinlein intended rockets to be. You wouldn't have this thing going up, shedding parts and just dropping them all over the landscape, never to be used again. No, you'd have this system that would take off and land like an airplane, only it would be vertical. And that's the inspiration that drove Elon. He said, oh, we can't just throw away parts if we're going to have a ecosystem that works economically for space settlement. That's just not affordable. We're going to have to reuse all our stuff. And so that's why SpaceX rockets take off and land on their tails, which hadn't been done before in real life.
Wow, it's cool to see the influence of the science fiction and how, this imagination really does come to life. And even you talk about, like speaking of like science fiction, they with soldiers, they are even working, DARPA's working on like what super soldier type, um, like an exoskeleton, like almost like an Iron Man type of device. Is that true?
Yeah, that's right. That's been a while. Things that could keep people awake without any bad effects. That's another thing. If you could stay awake for days at a time with no reduction in performance or long-term harm. That would be a great benefit. Ways to heal quickly, uh, artificial blood, things like this have long been staples of science fiction that DARPA at various times through various programs have tried to enact. And the prosthetic limb project that I wrote about in my book was kind of an extension of that. And the guy who ran that was an Army colonel named Jeffrey Ling, and his inspiration, if you want to call it that, was his horror at the number of people who'd been blown up in Iraq and Afghanistan at that time who survived as amputees because we had new body armor that let people survive things that would have killed them in the past. But then, you've got typically young people who are missing limbs. How can we get those people back to work, doing whatever they want to do? How can we help them? His idea was not as a super soldier, but someone who just could be restored to function. Although one of the sort of subjects and innovators here was a guy who had lost an arm in Afghanistan, or is it Iraq now? It's a little fuzzy at the moment. It's been a while, but I asked him, how are you going to use a computer mouse with this thing? He said, well, why do I need a mouse? Why can't I just have a direct link to my computer? I'm going to have the thing in my head. Why not have it do other things too, not just drive the arm? So in that sense, I guess it could give more than human capabilities, but the emphasis always was not that, but to restore someone to function.
Yeah, and then you look at the advancement that came today. I mean, I remember, I think you were writing about even back then. I remember the guy Oscar Pistorius,
Yeah.
that yeah, the runner. Um, so let's talk about some other organizations that came from DARPA. I mean, because of some of these challenges they put out. I mean, at one time there was something called the Massive Digital Data Systems Grant, and this was Sergey Brin and Larry Page were funded by this, right?
I don't actually know about that project, so you
Okay.
may know more about that than
Yeah,
I do.
okay. Well, this is the origins of Google because Google was actually funded by DARPA, and is a DARPA slash NSF program, but Google was created, birthed from that, and the idea was to track a user's digital footprint.
Mm.
And so this was all birthed and funded by Google. And it's actually interesting because it's hard to find the information on Google. You have to almost use a different search engine for it to come up more clearly, but it's right there
Mm.
in the white papers. But so that's not something that you're interested in, this is happening right almost after you wrote the book.
Well, it sounds like things that might have come out of the Total Information Awareness Project
Exactly.
that
Yes.
had happened just before I started writing my book. And this was another one of these existential moments when people got wind of this and they went, well, what is DARPA intending to surveil everybody in the country and all their transactions? And, this is a huge privacy concern. Well, the head of that program office ended up getting fired. Tony Tether almost lost his job, which he totally, I don't know, jokingly or not, viewed as a mark of success. All right, I guess I'm doing something right. I almost got fired there. But that work a lot of it went underground. Went NSF, as you mentioned, went dark, where it was out of public sight. So some critics of that kind of crackdown said, well, at least total information awareness was above board. We could see what they were doing. They were publishing their work. They were showing what they intended. Now it's all dark, so we don't know what they're doing. And of course, we found out with the leaks later that, oh yeah, they were doing a lot of stuff that people didn't like.
Yeah, so that seems like that's one of those more adds to the conspiracy where people think that Google's working with the government. Well, I guess we know, and Elon exposed that with the Twitter files, so we know that there are some collusions between the government and big tech at times. So
Oh yeah,
it's
no, it's quite explicit. The big companies are often hired as contractors to enact projects, not just for DARPA, but for mm, you know, Army, Air Force, you name it, NSF, whoever. they'll turn to industry to, a lot of the branches of the military have their own research and development infrastructures. Unlike DARPA, they'll have laboratories and things like that, but they also do still hire out contractors to do things.
Yeah. And so let's end on a couple of the cooler things that DARPA has been behind that, since you wrote your book, some of these things that came out of it. So for example, Siri, right? Or Alexa, the personal, they
That's
called it
right.
something different though, right?
Yeah, the project was called PAL, Personal Assistant That Learns. And that was at SRI, that same institute that
Stanford Research Institute. We know about them from Project Stargate. We did an episode on that.
Great. Yeah, and they were also the second node on the internet. UCLA connected to them in 1969 to create that first connection on ARPANET. When I was writing my book, they were working on this project called PAL, and it eventually spun out as Siri. And that was the first personal assistant that you could talk to that really could do anything. And I think now it's fallen well behind others like um, Alexa from Amazon, for example. It's not quite as capable, and I was not that impressed with it when I read the book. In my book, I said it was sort of like talking to a European tourist, sort of haltingly and maybe not quite, understandable all the time. So you're trying to ask them directions, or maybe your English, your German is faulty, or whatever analogy I used. But at the time, it was a really big problem. How do you get computers to understand spoken language? That was a really tough problem, but lots of computer power and lots of work went into trying to get that to happen. And true to form, with a lot of successful DARPA projects, they took the technology excuse off the table and unleashed all this innovation. They showed, oh, it can actually be done. You can actually speak to a machine, it can understand you, and it can give you a response based on that understanding. And that set off this wave, but it took a while, again, for that to really get going. The internet took decades. Self-driving cars, it's taken a while. At the time when I was writing, I covered the third self-driving car race that DARPA launched, the Urban Challenge. I covered that for Wired as well as in my book. They were saying on the ground, 5, 7 years. That was back in, I can't remember the exact date. I think it was 2008. Of course, here we are, much longer than 5 to 7 years, but now it's there. It's in production vehicles. And there's been so much hype around that people I don't think still quite understand how influential this is going to be. What a game changer this is actually going to turn out to be. Cars will actually drive you around with no input and without you having to supervise. That's just around the corner now. And the personal assistant that learns thing, talking to the machines, that's still evolving. Now with Gen
AI.
AI,
Mhm.
generative AI has gotten much more capable. But it all starts there with that really basic research demonstrating that something is at least technically feasible, even if it's going to take a while to really make it viable as a commercial product or something that could really be useful for the military.
Yeah, it really is cool. And if people want to find out how to pitch DARPA, they can go to your website, right? Get your ebook.
That's right, michaelbelfiore.com, Belfiore. It's a free download. And you also join my mailing list by doing that. So talking about things I'm covering now and just crazy stuff that's happening in the world. And then it's a how to hopefully it's relatively entertaining read because I've got this through line of this mad scientist with a time machine idea going.